All right, for the February book club, we welcome to the February book club of You're Probably Getting Screwed. I am very excited about today's guest. David Dayen is the executive director of the American Prospect, and one of the his podcasts, Organized Money, is something everybody should be following. He is the author of Monopolized: Life in the Age of Corporate Power. Welcome to the book club.
Thank you so much for having me, JD.
Yeah. So before we get into the book, I wanted to let folks know a little bit about your background as a journalist. Full disclosure, I'm a huge nerd fan of yours. Here's when I decided to run for office for Congress in 2020 or 2018. I did a lot of research, and it seemed like every time like I was something passionate about something, there was an article you wrote about 6 months beforehand. So you're way above the curve when it comes to that. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. But let folks know what your background is.
Sure. So I've, as you mentioned, been a journalist for a number of years now. Since 2019, I have been the executive editor of the American Prospect, which is a magazine about ideas, politics, and power. I still write in that capacity quite a bit about everything that's going on. I think sometimes my role is to sort of translate the business pages for real people and tell them why things that are happening in business matter.
Absolutely. And I encourage everyone to subscribe to that. And then also your Organized Money podcast with Matt Stoller just
Yeah.
started a few months ago, but absolutely fantastic. The latest episode that I heard was on utilities. And it's
hmm
interesting because the governor of Iowa has an energy bill. And so I sent this to the person who's overseeing the bill on the Democratic side and said, listen, as we have this debate and argument, this is things we should be following. So your podcast has direct influence on what's happening here in Iowa.
Well, that's terrific. That's great to know because that's what we all want is some impact. Yeah, on organized money, we talk to business leaders, we talk to policymakers, people who are living with monopoly and dealing with it and fighting back. And, a lot of those kinds of themes were also prevalent in the book when I wrote it in 2020.
Absolutely. So let's get to the book. And I think it's an interesting conversation we're going to have now because it's 4 years since it's been out, but
Yeah.
it's still extremely relevant. What made you want to write about monopolies and the book in general?
Well, at that time, there were a lot of books that were just starting to wrestle with this whole concept of monopoly, which had sort of been abandoned for 40 years, but was making a comeback intellectually. And the way that I saw it, what was missing in that overall discourse was to talk to ordinary people who were living through monopoly, who were
Yeah.
experiencing it in their daily lives, and were understanding that their feeling of loss of control, their feeling of loss of power was actually due to these larger forces. And, I talked to you for the book, for example.
Yeah.
I feel like that's why I'm on here because you're in the book. But,
I should have told
maybe
folks at the
that's true,
beginning.
maybe not. But, I talked when I was in Iowa, talked to, farmers who were dealing with having to deal with big agribusinesses, seeing their communities hollowed out, what the effect of agribusiness was on the broader ability to, have this opportunity to display your talents in farming, and how that was being cut off. I remember this great conversation I had with the pig farmer in Clear Lake, Iowa, who I'm sure you know very,
Chris
very well,
Peterson.
Chris
Yeah.
Peterson. Talking to him about his kid who grew up with him. He's a multi-generational farmer in Clear Lake, and his daughter ended up working at a Best Western. And I remember this great conversation with him where he said, she called me one day and she was having kind of a bad day and she was telling me about this and that happening in her life. And she just sort of broke down and said, look, all I ever wanted to do was farm. And so it was this idea of, I know what I want to do. I'm good at it. and I'm not allowed to because of the structure and forces in this economy. And that is what it is like to live in a life, in the age of corporate power. So that's what I wanted to really get at in the book.
So I think this is why it's one of my favorite books, is because when we talk about taking on monopolies and corporate power and things, it can either be a little bit academic
Right,
or something that doesn't really relate to people. And I
right.
think the beauty of your book, it reminds me of a history professor I had who talked about statistics don't bleed. You know, you can say 25 million Russians died in World War II, but until you read the story about one particular
Right.
person, it kind of just goes over your head. And so all these stories, I think, just really makes that connection of why these monopolies hurt everyday citizens here in this country. And
Yeah.
did you, is there, what was, I guess I'm curious, like you mentioned about Chris and that obviously, and I'm in the book, so like biasly towards that, but what were some of your favorite stories, or and maybe not favorite and like exciting, but like just like ones that like really hit home to you?
Well, it was great to talk to people who you kind of didn't expect to have the response or connection that you would with them. So, with this one lady who I talked to, she was a huge Trump supporter. I wrote this during Trump's first term,
Yeah.
and she was dealing with a situation around rental housing and private equity coming in and being these landlords for single family rentals and having all kinds of problems with them being sort of absentee landlords and dealing with jacking up rents and trying to kick people out and not being able to get repairs done. And she started this sort of crusade to bring together coalitions of renters who were fighting back against the Blackstone and some of these other organizations that were putting together all these single family rental units. And I said to her, Steven Schwartzman, who's the head of Blackstone, is a big Trump supporter. She's like, I know, I think I can reach him because I'm a Trump supporter too. And to see that this was not bound by party or ideology, to see that as many Democrats feel like this is a major disruptive force in American life, you also see Republicans talking about it. I had another libertarian that was talking about how she had this impossible situation with broadband in her rural area of Tennessee. And she told me this incredible story about her husband is a diabetic, and he was on a monitor that was hooked up through her phone. And she would be able to see if his blood sugar was low based on readings from her phone. The problem is that you need a continuous connection in order for that to work. And so when there was a sort of a hot spot or something, and she wasn't able to get her internet for a number of minutes, she got this alert, but it was like 5 minutes later than it should have been. She found her husband sort of slumped over in his office, and she was able to revive him and get everything to be okay. But it was an example of just reliable broadband being something that is a life or death situation in her case, and someone who has this belief system maybe that you would expect from a libertarian of the government is just getting in the way, and but she realized that as was said by Gail Slater, who's the incoming head of the antitrust division of the Justice Department, tyranny.com can be as bad as tyranny.gov. And
Exactly.
she saw that in her daily life. So, it was great to talk to people, sometimes surprising people, about how they were living with monopoly.
So one thing I've been thinking a lot since I reached out about having you on is because this book was written during the Trump administration,
Right.
the first time, and I'm coming at this a little bit too because when I was running for Congress initially in 2018, I felt like I was the only one talking about the Packers and Stockyards Act,
Right.
I felt like I was kind of in a silo. Where have you seen things shifted, and if there was, so to speak, a 2.0 version or a
Hmm.
next version of the book,
Right.
what would you see? Like, what would that be about?
Well, here's what I think is really interesting. So, as I said, the whole concept behind the book was to bring antitrust out of the academy, to bring it out of the ivory tower, and to talk to people where they live and how they're dealing with monopoly directly. And then we had an administration with Joe Biden that put in place really aggressive antitrust enforcers. People like Jonathan Cantor, who was the head of the antitrust division of the Justice Department, people like Lena Khan, who is the chair of the Federal Trade Commission. And a lot of what they did was similar to the project in the book, going out into the country and talking to people directly who were dealing with monopolies, whether it was pharmacists dealing with pharmacy benefit managers, whether it was farmers dealing with agribusiness and problems with inputs and problems with food processors on the output side, whether it was small businesses who were struggling to compete on Amazon or things like that. And they really took a very similar approach of getting it out of the academy, getting it out of sort of the ways in which these things are talked about in courtrooms, and using that information and using that perspective to really make the decisions on what they were going to challenge, what the biggest cases and the biggest problems were, and how they were going to address them. And I think they were really, really successful in that.
Yeah,
And in really bringing this down to a level that people can understand, and that people can understand sort of, okay, I'm having this loss of control, I'm feeling out of power, and here's the reason why, and I'm not alone in it. And so I think part of the success that we saw with the Biden administration in this particular sphere was because there was this concerted effort to get out into the country. And how that manifested itself is they wrote new merger guidelines that, for example, that are take a much more aggressive approach to dealing with mergers and acquisitions. They engaged in anti-monopolization cases against companies like Google and Ticketmaster, and a whole host of other companies that have abused the various laws that are set up to promote competition. And they even look to people in cases that you think might have been, maybe you don't think of them as the most important and pressing problems that people had, but a good example is the McFlurry machines at McDonald's, right? So
yeah,
there is such a lore of these machines being broken that there was a website set up to tell you whether or not the McDonald's McFlurry machine in your area is working or not. And the reason why is that there was this bottleneck where the manufacturer would only let the equipment be repaired by the original equipment manufacturer. And as a result, there was this huge backlog, and there was always these problems with the machines. They wouldn't allow the workers at the McDonald's to actually fix the machine. Well, there was, spurred on by the Federal Trade Commission, an actual change in policy that said, actually, the individuals who work the machine every day are allowed to fix it. And as a result, there's been this ability to repair their own equipment. And this we've seen extended, right, particularly in farm country with John Deere and some of the other equipment manufacturers. We've seen individuals who own this equipment wanting to fix it themselves and being able to do so. So, even the little things like that, we've seen progress moving forward on. And so I think that keeping that top of mind, Jonathan Cantor said to me, I always viewed my client as the American people when I was in government. And in order to be a good steward of your client, you have to talk to them. You have to talk to your client. And I think the fact that they did that and they sort of demystified antitrust in a lot of ways was a big factor in their success.
People ask me what's one of my proudest things I've done when it comes to being in the state legislature. And it was getting Lena Khan to come to Iowa to talk about the Cook Industries buying the Iowa Fertilizer Company and the
Right.
impact of that, and having Iowa farmers having the ability to talk to the chair of the FTC on the issue. And
Yeah,
so
it's great.
I was so excited that they were able to do that. Our first audience question I got, so all week or all month we've been asking
Hmm.
folks to ask questions, and I like this one. Who is the modern Robert Bork? And first, do you want to give a brief little background of who Robert Bork is?
Sure. I mean, Robert Bork was the individual who really changed antitrust law without actually changing the statute itself. Bork was a law professor. He was most famously at Yale, but he came from a sort of a school of thought most exemplified by the University of Chicago. And it was a very laissez-faire kind of look at antitrust, saying that, mergers are inevitably much more efficient. And the only reason we should stop a merger is if there was a price harm where the price would rise. And that would never happen with a merger because they're ultimately so much more efficient. So it was kind of tautological a little bit.
Yeah.
Bork really led this movement. He wrote a book called The Antitrust Paradox that changed the mind of judges, changed the mind of the incoming Reagan administration, who then made merger guidelines that said, we're going to take a hands-off approach to this, and really ushered in about 40 years of untrammeled economic consolidation. Now, you say, who is today's Robert Bork? I would have to say it would come from the other side. You would have to say it would be Lena Khan would be today's Robert Bork, because Lena Khan reinvigorated the law, returned to the statute, said we are going to base our decisions as antitrust enforcers on whether the law is being broken. What a novel concept. And we're going to put in place structures that reinforce that. And that's what they did. They rewrote the merger guidelines to away from a Borkian approach and toward an approach that refers back to the statute and what the actual law says and what various court justices have said about various cases over the years. And we're going to return to sort of an originalist kind of understanding of antitrust law without having to change the law itself. And so I would say that Lena is sort of a mirror image of Robert Bork in this context, and she would be the one who I would mention.
Absolutely. And going into those merger guidelines that you've talked on both sides, where Bork changed them and now Lena has changed them as well, along with Jonathan Cantor, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
The new administration and the new chair of the FTC, they agreed to those merger guidelines, didn't
They
they?
agreed to continue with that approach. And the interesting thing is that it's not just the antitrust enforcers that are, allowing for this continuity, but judges are paying attention to these as well. And you ask, like, what are these merger guidelines and what does it mean? It's a way for judges to understand this is the understanding of the law in the view of the United States government, right? And, there are a lot of judges out there who get these cases who don't really have a lot of experience with antitrust law, and they're looking to the government to understand, okay, what are the cases in which you will intervene and say that this is an illegal merger? And the antitrust merger guidelines have been used in their first year. They were cited 10 times in cases. And for context, the 2010 merger guidelines were only cited 4 times in their first year of operation. So it's really actually, you're seeing this learning process on the part of the judges where they are picking up from these guidelines that, okay, this is the way the law works. And this is the way, and it's very similar to the thought process that led to sort of the Borkian revolution on antitrust back, in the 1980s. So I think even more so, this whole idea that Lena is sort of the anti-Robert Bork. If you look at the merger guidelines and how they're being used by judges, you're seeing that process play out.
Yeah. Second audience question. What
Mm-hmm.
are your thoughts on the broligarchy?
So I think this is referring to, there was this line at the inauguration of people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. They were actually in front of the president's own cabinet at the inauguration. I think even though we're seeing this continuity with regard to the antitrust enforcers that Trump has put in, and let's remember the Google case that the Justice Department won, the monopolization case, that was actually started in the Trump administration. The Facebook case that's going to go to trial at the FTC later on this year, that was started during the Trump administration. So there is a little bit of continuity there. However, the oligarchy is certainly trying to put a stop to that. And one of, I think, the main reasons why there's been this shift among tech leadership this time around in the Trump administration relative to the first term is because they're trying very specifically to reverse those cases, to get those tossed out of court, and to move forward with the kind of light resistance, light touch approach that they would like to see. So, I think it's very dangerous for the country to have these people in power, to have these people influencing the administration. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be successful necessarily. And I think we're seeing whether it's state level cases where state AGs are getting involved, or even cases brought by individual private actors, like the Epic Games case against Google, for example. We're going to continue to see pushback against big tech. And I think that the fact that we had this 4 years of buildup of case law precedent, that it's going to help in that process, even if the Trump administration ultimately reverts back to giving oligarchs what they want.
So our last question that we got from subscribers, this is the same person. He asks everybody this. So what are you hopeful for?
Well, hope isn't an emotion that has come up very much, I think, in the first month of this Trump administration.
Right.
However, I personally see a lot of pushback, even in bright red districts, in town hall meetings, in communications with individual lawmakers, that shows me that I think people have real reservations about some of the things that have been going on, the attacks on the federal workforce. Eventually, those are going to manifest in the kinds of problems that you're going to see at the national parks or other consumer-facing kind of things that are happening out there. And I think we're seeing a considered pushback to this sort of attempt at a hostile takeover of the U.S. government. And so that does make me hopeful. And I think it's bound to continue. I think, what's happening at the state level with state lawmakers like yourself is going to be instrumental in seeing if we have considered pushback to the kinds of things the Trump administration is doing, and whether progress can be made in other formats in other states at the state legislative level. And so, I'm open to hearing about some of these good stories and reporting on.
Wonderful. Okay, we'll get into our final questions here.
Okay.
What's another book we should be having on this book club?
Well, I'm not sure what you've had in the past, but
That's fair.
there are a number of really great books out there that look into the structures underlying our economy. One of the greatest chroniclers of all this is a guy named Christopher Leonard. I don't know if you've had some of his books like Cokeland or The Meat Racket,
The meat racket's
but
very influential for my politics. I'll say
yeah,
that.
absolutely. So, I mean, Chris Leonard is a great writer and reporter, and so any of his books I think would be great.
Who's one person that we all should be following?
Well, I mean, my co-host on Organized Money, Matt Stoller, is obviously someone who I think is really important in this time. I also, excuse me, if you're looking at the federal workforce and like that's such a huge story right now, really important. There's a woman named Marissa Kabas, Marissa Mirisa Kabas Kabas, who's doing incredible work. She's an independent writer. She has a website called The Handbasket, and she's doing really good work on the assault on the federal workforce.
Oh, very cool. I have to follow that. And what's one thing you wish the general public would know more about?
That's a good question. I think a lot of the things I write about in Monopolized continue to this day, particularly in healthcare, where we think a lot about insurance companies and we think a lot about some of the sort of broader structures and the things that we know. But there are all these kind of middlemen and other rackets that are so involved in healthcare, whether it's pharmacy benefit managers, whether it's group purchasing organizations, those kinds of things I think are really critical to understanding why healthcare in America is the way it is. And so, a better understanding of the kind of middleman racket in healthcare would be good.
Absolutely. Just put it on your radar. There's a PBM bill in Iowa, and if we
Great.
don't, we passed it out of the House last year. The Senate didn't pick it up. If we don't pass it, there's a study by Drake University that said 60% of independent pharmacies in the state of Iowa will go under in the next year.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean,
Yeah, that's how drastic.
It's a dire situation for independent pharmacists.
Yeah.
And well, good luck with that bill.
Thank you. Lastly, where can people follow your work?
Sure. So prospect.org is where the American Prospect is located. We have a daily website where we're documenting everything that's going on. We also do a print magazine 6 times a year. I spend most of my time at this point at Blue Sky, and that is at ddayen.bsky.social. So you can find me on Blue Sky. You just look around. I'm sure you can find it. I'm also on Twitter at ddayen, DDAYEN, and that's where you can find me.
Wonderful. And I'll just say on Blue Sky, I don't follow too many people as I'm still new on it, but you're one of them, and it's always very informative and just good work on there. So I encourage you to keep it up.
Appreciate it.
Any more books coming in the future?
Well, we'll see. I mean, I don't have anything to report right now on that front, but the magazine takes up a lot of my time. But we are talking about other ideas, and if there's anything coming, I'll certainly let you know.
Well, with the magazine and the podcast, folks, I highly encourage you to follow both. Very informative, top-notch journalism, and you can see why he's one of the best journalists we got in this country. So with that, I just want to say thank you, and thank you for giving us Monopolized.
Thanks a lot, JD. Appreciate it.